Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, and today we are going to talk about Lemuria and the development of the human form in Lemuria and the metamorphosis of the human form over time. And one of the reasons why I am spending the time to lecture on this topic is because one of the most popular narratives in the New Age and quickly becoming mainstream is the idea that human beings were created through some kind of hybridization process or genetic manipulation, and that ultimately human beings will evolve through genetic manipulation via intelligent design, and also potentially even through the very extreme form of human modification called transhumanism, which is literally putting computer parts inside of you. So we sort of stand at this precipice where human beings can take the organic evolutionary path, and evolve with nature and with the cosmos properly, as we talked about in our last lecture, as a member of the 10th hierarchy of angels. Or we can basically destroy our form and devolve and degenerate, and go into a lower evolutionary path. And this is a very important conversation. So we're not really going to understand what these two paths are in humanity unless we deeply grasp our past, our ancient past, because what's going on in society is that because we become less and less spiritually oriented, truly spiritually oriented, we're not really able to factor in our true history. Because if you look at humanity's history and you look at the planet's history, we're really looking at shifts in density that have occurred in our deep and ancient past. So in other words, humanity has not been in the same form all of this time. And so kind of the materialist knee-jerk reaction is to think that there's some kind of genetic modification in our ancient past that's responsible for what we are today, or going into completely materialist approaches like Darwinism. But in reality, that is just trying to make up for the fact that we're missing spirituality, and not just sentimental sense of spirituality, but actual spiritual and esoteric science that covers and explains the past epochs of humanity and the human evolutionary stages in those epochs and the planet's evolutionary stages in those epochs. And when we do take a look back at that with the proper mindset, we can see that the planet and the human being is subject to metamorphosis, a natural process of metamorphosis over an extremely long period of time, to the point where the human being in the earth can be in an astral form, an etheric form, and even a physical form, and then rises back up. And so unless we understand this as the foundation of our existence, we're not going to interact with any of these ideas properly. We're not going to understand our own, creation or our own origin properly unless we can think about it in the light of spiritual science, which just means factoring in different densities and different dimensions, and not being so trapped and demanding that everything fit into this arrogant materialist worldview that we try to force everything into, because it just doesn't work. And if you do try to take a topic that is fundamentally interdimensional, it's fundamentally a spiritual topic, meaning existing partly in another dimension or another spiritual plane, if you do try to approach that with a materialist worldview, you will get that so wrong overall, because it's not a materialist concept. And so the real risk that we face today is entering into topics that are multidimensional with a one-dimensional mindset, which automatically traps us in the lower planes, which automatically traps us in a devolutionary pattern, because we're profaning the topic, because we're not entering into it from the right consciousness. And so that automatically leads to a devolutionary track for the individual and also for society. So our challenge is to not even necessarily, become more spiritual. Our path is to now understand spirituality as a science. So we can actually perceive our past and our own evolution properly, if that makes sense. So we're going to get into that today. We're going to talk about how the human form has come to be what it is. And I assure you that it is not through aliens coming to the planet and taking an ape and mixing this advanced, DNA with an ape to create us, to mine gold or whatever, or however many Mars origin myths there are, alien origin myths there are. That is not where Earth humanity, or really any humanity, has come from. These events perhaps have occurred at certain points. We've been modified, as I've stated many different times, but that is not the origin of humanity. All right, hybridization is not the origin, and neither is genetic, and genetic modification doesn't even provide an evolutionary impulse. You can't modify yourself to health. You can't modify yourself to spirituality through messing with your genetics. And that's going to potentially be a very hard lesson that humanity has to learn. So it's best that we grasp this now. So we're going to get into how, we're going to get right into it, even into how the human form first emerged, and how we began to even get the beginnings of organs and, circulatory system, all of that stuff. We're going to get into how that happens. And we're going to, in this lecture, focus mainly on Lemuria. And then in our next lecture, we'll focus on the evolution of humanity more in Atlantis. And the next lecture, we'll get a little bit into fallen angels and some of the crazy things that were going on during the Atlantean epoch that are also very important for us to know now if we want to understand the climate that we are in today. Okay, so how does the human being, how does the human body, how does the human form materialize? Exactly. It's not enough to just say we evolved through metamorphosis or that we've materialized over time from an astral condition to a material one. It's a good start, but it's not enough. So how do we actually get organs, physical organs in our body, like our kidney, our liver, our heart, our circulatory system, our nervous system? How does all of that begin to appear? How did our body begin to materialize? Okay. So the key here is that the human form took on its exact form, and all metamorphoses that happened to the form over time by exposure to certain spiritual energies. So basically, the form is like a magnetic strip, or the form is impressed upon by spiritual energies, and the form begins to mirror and take on and express the spiritual energies that we are exposed to. So that's actually how our form began, and that's how our form evolved, is by literally taking the shape of its environment, its spiritual environment. So how exactly does that occur? Well, the first way in which that happens is that we are exposed to very specific cosmic rays. So as I've mentioned in our previous lecture, that we are really looking to tap into that Christ impulse and evolve with the cosmos, with the earth, with the sun, with all the planetary bodies. We're looking to be in that natural life wave. And so we're actually always receiving The best way I could describe it is cosmic rays. And within those cosmic rays that are part physical, but a huge aspect of it is actually spiritual or working upon our higher bodies, is that we're receiving them and we are getting, I guess you could say, certain codes or information. And that is actually affecting our form. So we're sort of radiated in a way, and that very slowly over time. Also, the solar rays are part of that. And again, this is not just, we're not just looking at this in a materialist sense, like I'm going to get a special tool and measure the cosmic rays or measure the sun's rays, the sun's radiation. That is part of it, but that's only the most material, obvious part of these rays. And there is a spiritual component to this that you cannot really measure with physical devices, but that the body, the cells, the body picks up upon and mirrors. Okay, so we evolve actually based on our environment, and we adapt based on these spiritual rays. Fundamentally, that's creating this kind of soup or environment that we are in. Now, this is not the same thing as the idea of adaptation, but it's sort of similar. But it's coming from a much more foundational level of our being. Okay. And we know that if you look at occult science or if you look at the mystery traditions, one of the things that is absolutely paramount to these traditions is that the planet's life is divided into different phases. And this is in the Eastern traditions, this is in the Western traditions. It's part of the way in which we track history over very long periods of time and consciousness over long periods of time, is we divide the planetaries, the planet's life into different sections. And these sections are called epochs. It also goes along with the zodiac as well. And so there's these different conditions that we actually are, that our form is taking on and incarnating into. And every single planetary epoch has a different condition. And every single planetary epoch has a different expression of the human form. So in the first two epochs, which are the Polarian epoch or the Hyperborean epoch, and I'm using the anthroposophical system here, in those two epochs, humanity was mainly in an astral condition. So the form was not even really looking like a human form. It didn't even have, 2 arms and 2 legs or anything like that. It was basically just sort of more of a nebulous shifting form that existed in the astral plane. But within that sort of nebulous shifting form in the astral plane, there was something called the Seed-Germ, or the seed of humanity itself and what it is to become. So even though we are evolving over time, from an astral form to an etheric form to a physical form, back to an etheric and then astral form again as our evolutionary arc, there is this seed within us, within our human body template, the Seed-Germ, that contains the entire journey of the human being. It's sort of completed form, or the power to complete our evolutionary journey. So even though we were in this sort of more nebulous astral form, within us there was still this seed that would lead to our perpetual regeneration in a higher image, that would allow us to grow epoch to epoch to epoch to take on a more complex and advanced material form. It was all within us. Even though we weren't expressing our totally perfected form, our completed form at that time, it was still within us. It was still part of our very being. And it is today, within us today, within our form today. There is every single incarnation our form has had, going back to our very materialization here, our most faintest materialization in the Polarian phase of development. That is also still within us, within the Seed-Germ within us. Just like our most advanced form, when we reach that level of angelic human, that is also within us as well. And so we are, in a sense, in time. But that timelessness is still within us as like a seed germ that we tap into and evolve from, if that makes sense. So the first two planetary epochs are very rarely spoken about. You don't hear a lot about the Polarian or Hyperborean epoch, simply because the form is so unrelatable to us, that it's very difficult. It's very difficult to conceptualize what it's like to be in a totally opposite condition than what we are now. But by the time we get to Lemuria, by the time we get to the Lemurian epoch, we start to get a lot more physical. And this is where usually people begin to have some memories of within their being, or it begins to become relatable. The form becomes probably most relatable. It's like the earliest way we can go back and observe the form, because it's kind of I guess it's like the first relatable form that we have now. But the beginning of Lemuria was still very etheric. And then by the middle and end of Lemuria, our form actually becomes denser and denser and denser and denser until eventually it becomes sort of like a jelly. Okay, it becomes sort of like a more physical jelly. It's still very pliable. A lot of the great seers of the past have described it as being almost like kind of like a fish, or having fish bones, and very, very basic, very, very basic organ system. And most of our soul was actually hovering outside of the form. Most of the consciousness was actually not yet woven into the form as we are today, but was actually hanging out outside of the body. And absolutely the kind of soul essences were outside the body too in the earlier epochs. So in Lemuria, that soul essence is drawn down a little bit closer into the body as it gets heavier and denser, as the planet gets more dense and humanity and the form gets more dense as well. But ultimately, what we could describe as the soul or the consciousness of the human being is actually sort of hovering just above it. And they're creating the form with their mind. You could see it as being, they're sort of, in a way, it's sort of like they're dreaming the form into existence. That's one way of viewing it. And of course, because we didn't have organs as we know it, these earlier phases of development had a completely different way of reproducing. The ways in which we reproduced during that epoch was through mitosis. So it was kind of like a daughter cell splitting off. And there was no gender in the beginning of the Lemurian epoch, but then by the end of the Lemurian epoch, we do see the proper form, the proper human form, not with all of its organs yet or its complex system. We see the beginning of the form, and we see the very beginning of genders splitting, but it's very like prepubescent looking. It's not the sort of forms and levels of maturity that we have now that began in the Atlantean epoch. Okay. So just discussing those first 3 planetary epochs, we can see that the human form that we have today was in completely different conditions. It was a different condition in the Polarian epoch to the Hyperborean epoch to the Lemurian epoch. It's getting denser and denser and denser as we go, which is what we call the materialization arc. And as we get denser and denser, the human form is becoming more defined and more similar to what we have now. It's becoming more complex. All right. And suddenly the form is beginning to more and more mirror and express and become an exact embodiment of the cosmos. Right? So ultimately, this was happening through the 2 ways that we discussed. The human form was exposed to certain cosmic rays or spiritual rays from the cosmos itself and the sun, and the body was shifting over time because of these influences. However, there were also beings in the angelic hierarchy, which we could really call ourselves, if you will, because those beings in the spiritual hierarchies or angelic hierarchies truly sacrificed an aspect of themselves for us to exist. And so we are them and they are us. We are joined through that sacrifice. So ultimately, you could call it our higher selves or these higher spiritual beings in the hierarchy. They're also beaming their consciousness downward and also assisting in the creation of this form. So I didn't say that an alien being came and, took our genetics and created this form. I didn't say that there was an ape and someone took the ape and then their own genetics and created humanity. No, this is something much more deeper and much more profound going on, which is that we have higher spiritual beings, and they're not aliens. They're better described as angels. And they are using their own mind forces to actually physically create form or to help these forms be created. Okay, so this means that we have to also understand that consciousness at that time of the spiritual hierarchies was very pure. And so when I say they're beaming their thoughts to create forms or to create bodies, they're doing so as a direct embodiment and expression of God. So they're almost just acting like an intermediary of the God forces. So they're just, forming a form that's an exact embodiment of God. So we have not gotten to the time period where there's fallen beings yet. That happens later in our evolution. We will get to that in our next lecture. So this is very innocent. This is a very innocent kind of developmental process still. Okay. So again, we have 2 elements that are creating the form. The first element is the environment itself, the actual cosmic soup of rays that we are in. That is going into the creation of our form and why it is taking the exact shape and function that it does. And then you also have beings from the angelic hierarchy using their thoughts to help create this form. And of course, now the human is in a much more etheric condition, so thoughts would be very powerful. Now, in our condition, which is extremely materialized, we don't really see the effect of our thoughts, but our thoughts are things, and they are absolutely creating shapes and flashes and things in the astral plane. They are doing that whether we realize it or not. And so we have to understand that in that evolutionary period, the Lemurian epoch, thoughts could absolutely create a thing. And so that's that level of development that we were in at that time. So really there was sort of a natural taking on of the environment, but then there was the assistance of angels. We had the assistance of the angelic hierarchy. Another way to look at it would be that angelic beings would take on and personify an impulse from the cosmos, and then they would beam it downwards to us, and then we would take it on. Okay, the form would take it on. The form at that time, again, as I mentioned in our last lecture, the form at that time, human consciousness at that time, we weren't individuals yet. We were still functioning as an interconnected hive mind, sort of. We didn't yet, the human being didn't yet have individuality. Okay, so it's important to know that as well. A lot of the First Nations cultures also reference this, and in a lot of their mythology, they called this the process of entering the dream. And you can also see it in a lot of myths and fairy tales that describe the idea of sleeping kings. Or in Alice in Wonderland, there is a passage in, I think, Alice Through the Looking Glass, where it's described that if the Red King were to wake up, then this entire world would be destroyed. And that Alice is really living in the Red King's dream. And so there's been a lot of hints at this in mythology, in fairy tales and stories, in various different esoteric traditions. The Aborigines also talk about their dream weaving and dreaming things into existence. And in a sense, our culture still does this with the idea of like the secret and manifestation and things like that. So the way that we often relate to this very, what sounds like a very strange process of the creation of our form, is that in a way we sort of dreamed these forms into existence. We dreamed these forms into existence, and then we entered the dream. And this also goes into things like the Matrix, which is obviously a very dark interpretation of this, or sort of taking this concept of the creation of form, and even honestly the hive mind thing of Lemuria and the prior epochs, and taking it into a really dark direction. But that's often what the occult does. The occult will pervert these ideas. And so we can even see it in shows like The Matrix, where literally Neo is almost like an individual that is entering into the dream, if you will. And that is very, very deep in our memory, in our cellular memory, in our spiritual memory. So that is one good way to look at it. Another way that we could look at it is that the archai, or these angels, these angelic consciousnesses that are creating the form or assisting in the creation of the form, they're sort of taking on the lesson of the age, or the lessons of the cosmos, or the energies of the cosmos at large, and they are then just sort of beaming them downward, and the form is then taking place. It's beginning to materialize, as it takes on the exact energy. So the form in that way truly is divine. The human form genuinely is divine. It is perfect. You may not like your form. You may not feel like your form represents you, or that you understand your body, but the human template of the earth is divine. The human form is divine. And our work is to enter into the form and spiritually work upon it, to spiritualize it out of this plane. That is our task in this epoch at this point in time. But, in the Lemurian epoch, we were still trying to materialize a form that was a direct embodiment of the spiritual hierarchies, that was going to be the 10th angel in the angelic hierarchy. We were still trying to materialize a form that would be holy enough and divine enough to make it through the further waves of materialization and then spiritualize itself into the higher astral planes again. So we actually had to create a form that's so divine and so holy that it could weather the intense compression of the materialization arc of planet and man, and then exist as we are, as divine in form. And then it had to be able to survive the spiritualization process out of the material plane. So our form is holy. Your body is holy. The human form is divine. It really is a temple. It really is the embodiment of the angels. It really, really is. So the human form is like, it's sort of the way that the human form actually formed was, it's sort of like we're magnetic tape, and we were just taking on all the impressions of the cosmos directly, and the angelic hierarchies were also directly working upon us, and that led to a very divine and holy form, which we have now. And it really wasn't until about halfway through the Atlantean epoch, and definitely into our post-Atlantean epoch, that we start seeing a lot of perversion and a lot of fallen angels and dark entities. So by the time our form had received its full template, it was already, in a sense, perfect. And we didn't start seeing these perversions of the form like genetic modification, transhumanism. We didn't really start to see that until Atlantis. So once we sort of got the form basically where it was a direct expression of the hierarchies, of the angelic hierarchies, then there started to, all of the evolution started to happen inwardly. So the external form was formed, and it had been perfected to the best degree that it could. And then sort of the evolutionary impulse went inside of us. And then that's where we see where we get our I, the development of mind or manas, and all of the transformation starts to happen in our inner world. And that's also where we start to see angels falling, and we start to see real evil manifesting in humanity and on the earth. But there was a period of development where that was not happening like that, as I've mentioned before. And it's really important to understand pre-fall humanity that was really very innocent, and there was that perfection of the form and the Seed-Germ, and then after the fall, which is where we start seeing the form perverted. We start seeing different types of genetic modification going on. We start seeing, darker forces on the planet trying to create chimeras, trying to do genetic engineering, trying to merge human beings with machines. We saw all of that in the Atlantean epoch. And so, there was still that, there were individuals right at that Atlantean period that really felt like the form still had to be worked upon. they didn't get the message that we were now entering a phase of spiritualization and we have to go inward. And so there was this whole culture, on Earth, and even within certain fallen aspects of the angelic hierarchies, where they kept thinking that you have to work upon physicality to evolve. That the physical form is needing to be changed. So really, that is where we see this shifting going on. It's really at the Atlantean epoch to now, where these individuals feel like human metamorphosis and evolution happens through physicality. And so that's one of the biggest challenges we face today. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the human form is what it is, and it's where it is because of our ability to metamorphosis over long periods of time as the direct image of the spiritual hierarchies and as the direct recipient of those hierarchies, the direct evolution of those hierarchies. So let's go a little bit deeper into how the angelic hierarchies have assisted in creating specific organs, and also, organs that are physical, but also we have spiritual organs of evolution as well. And let's get in a little bit deeper into how that metamorphosis happens. The German poet Goethe described exactly how humanity took on the form and organs we have today when he said, "The eye has been formed through the light and for the light." In Goethe's theory of colors, he states that the eye may be said to owe its existence to light, which falls forth, as it were, a sense that is akin to itself. The eye, in short, is formed with reference to light, to be fit for the action of light. The light it contains corresponding with the light without, or the light outside. What Goethe is describing here is the reality that humanity developed its faculties and form through the exposure to certain higher archetypal forces, or that human beings' organs and entire body materialized by being exposed to certain higher spiritual forces that they eventually materialized within themselves as a way to perceive them fully, as a way to perceive their environment fully. In this way, sound waves also led to the creation of the ear, and all organs materialized as a response to specific cosmic stimuli or to their environment. This means that human creation and evolution is really the progressive embodiment of higher worlds through our exposure to them. Human evolution and creation is really a process of metamorphosis. Each epoch, the form becomes more and more complex and more refined as it progressively embodies the impulses of the cosmos or the impulses of the Godhead. Let's go even deeper into this concept. As mentioned, if we look closely, we see that as part of the spiritual hierarchy, human beings receive these impulses with the help of the angels, or the higher spiritual beings in the cosmos. So as humanity is part of the angelic hierarchy, we evolve in part by what is passed down to us from them. And angels are purely embodying the evolution of the Godhead itself. They are pure embodiments of the Godhead, of the Logos. Thus, we take on certain faculties or organs that were initially introduced by the beings of the spiritual hierarchies, and we evolve them even more in our evolutionary scheme, or we evolve these faculties and organs by taking them on, by using them, by developing them, by accepting them, by taking on the task of using them, by bringing them to life in this realm. In this way, human beings receive certain faculties that were initially created by the beings in the spiritual hierarchies. In turn, the more that humanity works upon themselves and uses these organs in their highest capacity, the more the spiritual hierarchies evolve. And in this way, we work in tandem with the spiritual hierarchies as an integral part of them. Each faculty we receive and properly develop reverberates a powerful evolutionary impulse back up into the higher spiritual orders, allowing them to stay connected to the material plane in a meaningful way. This process of spiritual imprinting and inheritance within the spiritual hierarchy is clearly laid out in Anthroposophy. In various lectures, Rudolf Steiner describes how organs are created for humanity by the Archangels. Each Archangel governs an age or time period, and during their governance, part of their task is to form a specific organ that will allow humanity to take on the task of the next era. This specific organ will allow humanity to perceive and interact with new forces that they will be receiving in the coming era. In this way, each archangel prepares humanity to perceive the influences of the coming age. So, archangels, as the living embodiments of the higher archetypal group consciousness of human beings, absorb the energies and themes of a specific era over time. And as they do this, they create a specific organ for mankind, a specific faculty for mankind. The organ that is created by the Archangel is an organ that is needed for the next era. In order for humanity to evolve, they must take on the task of developing this organ or new faculty. In Theosophy, this was also touched upon by the teaching that every new age, every new epoch, advanced faculties would emerge in humanity. Thus, humanity is never truly the same in its perception, epoch to epoch or age to age. These faculties would allow the human being to evolve and stay connected to the spiritual hierarchies from which they emerged initially. Let's take a look directly at what Rudolf Steiner says about this process in a lecture titled Esoteric Lessons 21, given in Berlin in 1907. Here he describes the evolution of the human form through the spiritual influence of the Archangel Gabriel. He also reveals that not developing this organ leads to the devolution or the potential destruction of the human form. He says, Archangel Gabriel transformed men's brains, and an organ developed in the forehead that should be used. If no spiritual content flowed into it, this part of the brain would wither, giving rise to infectious diseases and pestilence. During Gabriel's influence from the years 1525 to 1879, organs were prepared that would allow humanity to receive the forces of the next era being the age of Archangel Michael. Steiner goes on to say, Archangel Gabriel brought it about that the organ that's in the sinus above the root of man's nose gradually developed. It's not directly perceptible physically, but if one could compare a recent corpse with one from the 13th century, one would find differences in structure in the windings of the brain at the place mentioned. Archangel Gabriel gradually prepared this organ in man so that man was able to take in the message of Archangel Michael, who was next in line in 1879. The significance of this development is that through this new organ, Michael would help humanity to perceive and understand spiritual information in a more objective way, giving way to spiritual science. This new way of relating to the spiritual world is an advancement from earlier eras of humanity that could only perceive the spiritual worlds in a very dreamy and superstitious way. To summarize, in the beginning of our existence on the earth, in the Polarian and Hyperborean epochs, our base physical body was just forming. Our body was simple, with no complex organs or systems. All complex systems were still in the astral plane or the spiritual plane, and only somewhat woven into the physical body. Then, once humanity reaches the Lemurian Epoch, the human form solidifies, and we finally see the very basic beginnings of the organs, nervous system, and circulatory system we have today. By the Atlantean Epoch, the human form has its major physical organs, a complex nervous system, circulatory system, and every basic physical system that we have today is now formed in the Atlantean Epoch. Now, in our current post-Atlantean Epoch, a new challenge begins. One where new organs are still being formed, just as in the prior epochs. However, these organs are not purely for physical function, as in earlier epochs. These organs, the ones we are taking on now, today, in our present epoch, are to assist with the spiritualization of humanity, or the ascension of humanity into a higher, more astral existence. Thus, in this Michael age, we see the development of an organ that is partially physical and partially etheric and astral, that specifically allows the human being to logically understand the spiritual dimensions. This then allows sovereign interaction with the spiritual world through individual understanding. It leads to the development of the I and the individuated soul. This individual understanding of the spiritual is what allows us to each work upon ourselves to, over time, spiritualize ourselves out of the material plane. In the future, each new age will also bring new faculties and new spiritual organs. We will see our form change again and again and again in future epochs. We will continue to metamorphosis. And this will increase our perception even more, preparing us to perceive the higher planes as we move into them. The directors of this transformation of humanity are the angelic beings in the spiritual hierarchies, the same forces that have led our formation and evolution from our very beginnings here. Humanity is the great beneficiary of the angels in the spiritual hierarchy, and the spiritual hierarchies directly evolve based on humanity's efforts. In this way, we are part of a great celestial order, moving through time, expressing and embodying the cosmos itself. Thank you everyone for joining me today. Please give this video a like comment, and subscribe. If you enjoy my work, please consider supporting it by becoming a member on my website or by making a donation. Thank you.